Right. I'm honored to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Don Choi. Dr. Don Choi specializes in the history of modern architecture. In particular, he researches the development of architecture in Japan since the 1800s, examining how Japan developed a distinct architectural culture. He's currently working on a book-length manuscript on architecture in modern Japan and has published a book on the Palm Springs architect, William F. Cody. In addition to teaching seminars on modern architecture, Dr. Choi teaches architectural history survey courses and the occasional design studio. He established the department's Japan off-campus program in Japan in 2016 and the South Korea program in 2023, and is taught for Cal Poly in London as well. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and I'd like to introduce Don Choi.
Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was lucky enough to do a couple of these seminars last year, and I'll start off with some really basic ideas. And let me go ahead and share my screen here as well, and we'll take a look at some images while I talk. All right, so today's seminar may be a little bit different than some of the other ones you've had, because most of you will not go into the field of architecture, and that's fine. And so what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about not so much the professional practice of architecture, but why any of us and all of us might be interested and engaged in the study of architecture. And so we'll talk about a number of kind of broad ideas behind the kind of reasons why I think it's important that everyone, regardless of whether engineer, doctor, business person, whatever you do, why architecture should be something that you think about. And so today we're going to talk about some very, very basic themes. And I want to start off with this very, very basic question about what is architecture and why should we think about it? You know, the number of architects in the world is actually relatively small. So we have lots of engineers. We have lots of people in the medical professions, nurses, doctors, and so forth. We have lots and lots of people who are in, say, construction, who are in computer science. So architecture, in a sense, is a relatively small field if you think about it in terms of people who go to school, get an architecture degree, and become licensed architects. So on one hand, architecture is a relatively small field. But on the other hand, of course, architecture is also a huge field because we're surrounded by buildings. Most of them are actually not designed by people who are what we might call architects. So most buildings in almost all places in the world are designed, for instance, by the people who actually live in them, or the people who build them, and not people who went to school and studied for, 5 or 8 years and then became professional architects. And so I want to think about architecture more generally, not just as famous buildings designed by famous designers, but as a kind of the built environment, all these buildings and spaces that we occupy, that we use, that we see every day. And so to think about architecture in that way, let's start with two fundamental questions. What is a kind of basic purpose of architecture? And one way we can think about architecture is in terms of shelter. And so here you're just seeing some old farmhouses in rural Japan. And these are buildings that are relatively simple. They weren't designed by architects. They were built by carpenters and then renovated by the people who lived in them. And so very simple buildings like this, we can think of beginning with the idea of shelter. As you can see in the image here, this is a mountainous region. It's cold, there's a lot of snow. And so these buildings are built with a thick, steep roof that helps keep the snow off. And so we can look at buildings like this, and you can see similar buildings in many places across the world, and think about them in terms of shelter. How do they keep you warm and safe, and so forth? If shelter is one kind of starting point for architecture, then another origin of architecture is really meaning, because there are some structures that actually do very little in terms of keeping out the animals and keeping us warm and keeping the rain off. And so there are many pieces of buildings, kinds of buildings that start with the idea of meaning. In other words, how do we create and build something that gives meaning in the way we use it, or the way we build it, or the way that we conceive it? So this is a set of big rocks, as you can see. It's Stonehenge in England. It's a very famous Stone Age monument. And we think that this structure had to do not obviously with defense or warmth or protection of any kind, but it had to do with meaning. So the way the stones are actually lined up creates these alignments so that you can see, for instance, the sunrise on the longest day of the year down one of these alignments. And so we think that Stonehenge here was in part a kind of calendar. So it told its builders when the longest day of the year was. And so this had a kind of, we think, religious meaning, and it also had functional meaning. Because if you are planting crops and harvesting crops, you need to know when to plant and when to harvest. And so one way to do that is to create a calendar like this, which tells you the longest and shortest days of the year. Because then once you have those two dates, you can figure out other dates, the equinoxes, when day and night are equal, and so forth. And so a structure like this is not functional in terms of utilitarian function, right? It doesn't keep us warm. It doesn't keep the animals away. But instead, the fundamental reason for something like this is meaning. So we can think about architecture as having these two fundamental bases, one meaning and the other one shelter. Now, when we look at architecture, we can see architecture from many perspectives. And one of the things that really drew me to the study of architecture was that it involves almost everything. It's technology, it's materials, it's symbol, it's decoration, it's form, it's all these things. And so let's think about a few ways in which we can think about architecture, ways that can make architecture meaningful for you, whether you are a student, a businesswoman, an engineer, a farmer, whatever you do. One way to think about architecture is in terms of art and aesthetics. So we can look at buildings and think about them in terms of the ways in which they're beautiful or powerful, the ways they work on our senses, for instance. And so many scholars of architecture in the past have thought about architecture as a kind of art, like painting or sculpture, as kind of a mode of expression and as a field of activity that creates beauty. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these ideas in a moment. Another way to think about architecture is in terms of technology and materials. So some buildings, for instance, the Eiffel Tower in Paris, really rely on a particular kind of material and certain kinds of technologies. And so when we look at certain structures, a lot of bridges, for instance, and tall towers, they're really dominated by the structural principles and the materials that are used. And as I mentioned, one of the reasons why architecture is so interesting to me is that it involves so many things. And in the past, if you think about cities from the past, the biggest investments those peoples made were often architecture. So the great temples, the great bridges, and the other huge structures that you see in the ancient world, those were the greatest investment of capital for those societies. So in ancient Rome, you had huge temples and the Colosseum. In ancient Egypt, you had the colossal temples and pyramids and so forth. In South Asia, you had huge scaled Hindu temples. And so all over the world, architecture has been an extremely expensive and capital intensive project. And this means that architecture really carries the values of the society that produced it. So when we see, for instance, in Rome, we see a colossal church that was built 500 years ago, we begin to understand the importance of the Christian religion in Italy in that period. And we can think about architecture in terms of who sponsored it and who built it, right? Who is providing the money? Why are they building, right? So it's often for these kind of political or religious reasons. So as you can see here, it's very useful to think about architecture from the perspectives of politics, society, and culture. But architecture is not just large special buildings. It's also everything around us, right? I'm in my office here at school, and we could talk about an office building in terms of its meanings for us as a kind of everyday environment, or the buildings you live in, the buildings you work in, right? All these structures that we use every day are vital, not only to keeping us safe and warm and all that, but also important to how we understand our place in the world. And so architecture as an everyday environment is something that is important for all of us. On the other hand, some buildings, many large buildings, for instance, also are engaged in actually taking us to another world. And so whether you are religious or not, you may have visited a temple or a church or a mosque or another kind of religious structure. And many of those buildings actually attempt to create alternative worlds. So they may, for instance, be constructed in order to bring a god or deity from one world to our world. Or they may be constructed as an imitation of heaven or paradise. And so some buildings really try to kind of create these connections between our everyday world here and another world, for instance, the world of the gods or the world of the spirits. And so architecture then is a kind of conduit, a kind of connector between one world and another. So let's take a look briefly at these 5 ideas, these 5 approaches to architecture. So I've just chosen a set of buildings, not really at random, but I could have chosen, any one of thousands of buildings to illustrate any of these examples. But the one I've chosen here is a building from 500 years ago, and it's from Italy. Don't worry about the name and all that kind of stuff. But I want to show it to you as an example of a building that was really treated as a work of art. This is a little tiny church building, so a Christian church. It's not very big, but it's very, very, very carefully designed. So in this period, patrons and architects really thought about architecture as a fine art, so that a building like this was like a great big 3-dimensional inhabitable structure, sculpture. And when we look at it, and here's a floor plan of the little temple here. It's perfectly round. It has 16 columns around it. It's symmetrical across 2 axes here. And so it's really intended to be a kind of beautiful, perfect object. And this idea of the kind of aesthetic perfection and beauty was related to other ideas in this period that we call the Renaissance in Italy. So the Renaissance has to do with the kind of rebirth of classical ideas. And central to the idea of architecture and art in this period was the use of proportion and order. This is a very famous image by Leonardo that many of you may have seen here or there. And what we see here is an image of a human who was inscribed in 2 simple geometrical forms. So when this man is standing with his arms stretched out like this, his arm span and his height, right? So his arm span here and his height are the same. And so you can inscribe this square like this. And you can see that the arm span and the height create this perfect square. Alternately, if you examine a human, sorry, having some mouse problems there. If you take the center here as the navel of this man, and then he stretches his arms out like this, and his legs out like this, then you can draw a circle with the center of the navel right here, and the arms here and the legs here will touch that circle. And so you can inscribe this figure, you can draw this figure inside a circle and also inside a square. And so what the designers and artists of this period were trying to do is to create works of art and architecture that satisfied these principles of geometry. So when we look at a building like this, we see circles and squares and simple ratios throughout the building, because this was fundamental to their understanding of beauty, right? That beautiful objects came from a manipulation of legible shapes and proportions. So for instance, a ratio of 3 to 5 here, so 3 to 5, or a ratio of 1 to 1, or 1 to 2, or here's a square that we can see here. And so all over this building, we have these simple proportions of 1 to 2, 1 to 3, and so forth. And so this was a way of establishing beauty in a building. So the same ideas are relevant to this inscription here, this etching, this drawing by Leonardo, right? And in the building. So in the drawing here, we see circles. And in the building too, everywhere we see circles. In the dome here, for instance, the dome here and here. So inside and outside, we see circles. And we also see that the individual pieces of the building, like this column here, they are also carefully designed to have proportions that are pleasing to the eye. So the architect here, a man named Donato Bramante, looked at architecture as a set of forms and proportions that were thought to be pleasing to the eye. So the whole building is considered as a kind of large three-dimensional work of art. But that way of understanding art as a kind of beautiful object is only one way of seeing architecture. So there are other buildings in which it's not so much the idea of proportion and beauty that are important, but for instance, technology and materials. This is the Eiffel Tower, right? One of the most famous buildings in the world, one of the most visited buildings in the world. And way back in 1889, this was an incredibly radical structure. Nowadays, we see lots of buildings that resemble this. Some of them are imitations of the Eiffel Tower. But back in 1889, this was a building unlike anything that had been built in Paris or any other city. And the reason I say this is because, well, even today, you can see the Eiffel Tower and it looks different than anything else in that picture. And the Eiffel Tower is a structure of iron. So not brick or stone or wood, which were the materials used in large-scale buildings in Europe and many other places in the world. But this was a structure of iron. And iron, of course, had been known for thousands of years, but it wasn't used in buildings like this because it was too expensive. But then with changes in technology, iron becomes affordable enough to create entire buildings out of it. And iron is so strong that it allows you to build much higher than structures like a brick or stone. So it's relatively strong in comparison to its weight. And the engineers who designed the Eiffel Tower were trying to take advantage of the particular qualities of iron that is very, very strong, which allows you to build very, very tall. And it also means that the shapes and the forms that they came up with were very different than those of traditional buildings. So there were certain kind of structural demands on a building this large. One was obviously the building is so heavy that you need strong foundations. Another is that with a building this tall, the actual wind forces are very, very high. So actually, the higher you get off the ground, the stronger the winds are. So with a building that's 1,000 feet tall, the wind is pushing really hard against it and will tend to push it over. And so there are these huge structural demands placed on a tower this large, and iron was well suited to this kind of structure. And so here we have a building that was by far the tallest in the world, and it was built, as I said, not out of stone or brick or wood, but out of iron. So everything about this building was different than conventional buildings. Its shape and appearance were different. Its structural principles were different. And as you can see, it's mostly a kind of open structure. So instead of having solid walls, It's this kind of open structure, so the wind can actually pass right through here. And that also helps a lot in making the tower more resistant to the high winds that we find off the ground. And so often when we have a new material used for building like iron, we also have new kinds of forms and shapes and conceptions that come with that material and technology. The same is true, for instance, with steel, which is of course a kind of alloy of iron, and of reinforced concrete as well. And so today we take for granted, I think, steel towers that look something like this. Whether it's the Eiffel Tower itself, or for instance, you might see power lines, you might see utility towers that are holding power lines that are also made out of steel. Or you might see radio towers or other transmission towers that are also made out of steel and are very, very tall. And so over the last 130 years, buildings that look something like this have been very, very familiar to us. But back then, the Eiffel Tower was so new in terms of its materials and form that it actually scandalized people. And so countless artists and architects and others protested the construction of this building because it didn't look like any other building they'd ever seen. And over time, of course, these new technologies become more familiar until they're no longer new. But in many cases, we have changes in technology that drive changes in architecture. What we're seeing right now, especially with computer-assisted design and computer-aided fabrication, is that we can now create shapes for buildings that would have been impossible even 20 years ago. And so that's the kind of current example of how technology and materials are transforming architecture. Now, some of the most famous buildings, the ones that we see in the news all the time, are structures like, for instance, the United States Capitol. And regardless of where you are, there is probably some building or set of buildings that represents your local or national government, right? Whether you are in Washington, D.C., or in London, or in Tokyo, there are some set of buildings that represents the government and by extension, the entire country. And so buildings like this have a very, very kind of heavy kind of symbolic meaning. And so often they are consciously designed to represent the government and the nation. So here in the United States, our city of Washington, D.C. was designed as a capital, as you can see, 230 years ago. And so this is a map of the city as it was designed by, actually, strangely enough, a French military officer. And he designed the whole city to represent the government. And so what we have here is there is the Capitol building right here. And then over here, we have the house of the president. Today, this is commonly called the White House, and it's still the residence of the president, 200 plus years later. And then in other places along here, there are important buildings and monuments. And so we have this connection between the government here and the president right here. And then all along here, we have museums and other civic buildings. So the idea was that this city, this new city of Washington, D.C., was planned to represent these kind of political ideals, right? So not a dictatorship, but a representative government, a democracy. And so the most important building here was the Capitol, because the Capitol is where the Congress meets and creates laws for the country. And so symbolically, this was not only the most important building, but it was placed at the highest point of the city. So there's a hill, and on top of that hill, which we now call Capitol Hill, we have the Capitol building. And so the whole city was really conceived then as a kind of representation of this new American government. Here's a modern painting of the first step in building that building, the Capitol. And so there is a ceremony, the laying of the cornerstone. And here we have the first US president, a guy named George Washington. And he is overseeing the placing of the cornerstone at the beginning of the construction of the United States Capitol building. And so this image represents both the beginning of the construction of the building, but also represents the start of the United States as a country, of our government. And over the years and decades, the building's expanded. So as the country of the United States grows, the building also grows. And the style that was chosen for this building, this is called a neoclassical style. And there were very clear reasons why the architects chose this style of building. Originally, the idea of representative government, of a kind of republic, comes from Greece, for ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And so when the builders of these early buildings for the United States Capitol of Washington, D.C., were designing buildings, they chose structures that were inspired by the buildings of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, right? So in the same way that the actual governmental structure, the democracy of the United States, was inspired by the democracy of ancient Rome, so too were the buildings of the United States Capitol inspired by ancient Rome. So one way to look at this building is, of course, in terms of the style that the architects chose. But what's so fascinating about buildings like this is that they have incredibly complex histories. So a building that's 200 years old, and many of you are in places where there are countless structures that are not 200, but they're 500 or 1,000 years more old, right? So over all those years, we have these very, very thick, rich, difficult histories that arise. For instance, in 1814, the US Capitol building was burned by the British. And so this was a huge blow to the early Republic of the United States. And so some members of our government wanted to move the capital of the country to a different city, one that might be, for instance, safer. But ultimately, the decision is made to keep the capital in Washington, D.C., and to reconstruct the building, because the reconstruction of that building was a sign of the resilience and the strength of the American government, right? So it was damaged by the British, but it was reconstructed. And then, in fact, a large dome, this big dome, was built on top as a symbol of the strength and the importance of the American government. And then when we move on a few more years, that big dome in the center there that you see, it gets built even larger. And this dome is actually built using an iron structure in here. So not stone and brick, which was the original structure, but iron, because iron was this relatively new material used for construction. You know, I mentioned it in the context of the Eiffel Tower. And so one idea behind using iron rather than stone or brick was to show off this new technology, to represent the United States as a kind of technologically advanced country. And of course, right, you know, this is what, 170 years ago almost. And so today, iron is not a high-tech material. We use a much stronger alloys like steel, for instance. But back then, in 1851, iron was rare as a building material. So it was expensive and it was new. And so the use of iron here was an attempt to show off, right, the wealth and the technological progress of the United States. And on top of this big dome, as you can see, there was a plan to erect a great statue. And the statue was to be called Freedom, because the United States prided itself on being a democracy where people were guaranteed certain rights. And so whether it was 1850 or today, many Americans like to believe that this country is a place of freedom. And so we have on the top of this most important building of the United States government, a statue that represented freedom. And on top of this statue, so it's a female figure that represents freedom. You can see it right at the very top there. And that figure is wearing a kind of hat, a cap. And that cap is called a Liberty cap. And the reason it's called that is that way, way, way back, 2,000 or more years ago, in ancient Greece and Rome, when an enslaved person was given their freedom, they were given this kind of cap or hat. So that's why it was called a Liberty cap. And you can see it a little better right here. And so that Liberty cap was associated with the idea of freedom. But one of the United States politicians, a guy named Jefferson Davis, says, well, we should not have this kind of hat on top of our Capitol building, because this kind of cap was given to enslaved people who were then granted freedom. And Jefferson Davis says, well, the American people, he claims, were born free. And since they were never enslaved, this hat was irrelevant, right? Because the hat was only given in ancient times to people who had been slaves and then were freed. And Jefferson Davis says, hey, Americans are not enslaved, so they would never have this cap. And so ultimately, a very different kind of hat was put on this big statue of freedom. Now, the irony here, of course, right? Jefferson Davis says, Americans are born free. But of course, many Americans were not born free at all, because in 1960, the United States was still a country of slavery. So there were millions of Americans who had no freedom. And so this statue was supposed to represent freedom. But of course, many Americans had no possibility of freedom. So the enslaved workers in the United States, in the South, they and their children and their grandchildren, right, would all be enslaved. So it is, of course, striking that one of our politicians claims that Americans are born free, because, of course, Black Americans were not born free. They were born into slavery. And also, on this project of building this statue, there was a guy named Philip Reed. It's hard to decipher that, but that's a guy named Philip Reed. And he worked on creating this statue. And Philip Reed was actually an enslaved Black American. And so here he was, without his freedom, working to create the Statue of Freedom that was intended to represent the liberty, the freedom of Americans. And so, as I mentioned, when we look at buildings like this, buildings that represent our country, buildings that have long histories, we can understand the incredible complexity of these buildings. So over time, they accrue more and more meanings, and some of those meanings are contradictory. The idea of a Statue of Freedom that was actually created in part by an enslaved man. And so, as I mentioned at the start, buildings and architecture are fascinating to me, in part because they hold all of these kind of sometimes conflicting meanings. Now, the new Capitol building in the United States was under construction during our Civil War in the early 1960s. And this Civil War was between the North and the South, between the northern states, which did not allow slavery, and the southern states, which relied on slavery. And so during this great time of Civil War, the construction of the Capitol building continued. So you can see in the background here, right? They're continuing to build the Capitol building. And some people want to know, right? Why during this period of war are we still building this structure? And President Abraham Lincoln says, right, this. In other words, for him, the Capitol building had become a powerful symbol of the United States. And so on one hand, there was also a building that over the decades had been constructed in no small part by enslaved labor, but it also becomes a symbol of the unity of the United States. And so its construction continues throughout the Civil War. Right, I mentioned that we have these long, difficult histories of buildings. And so a couple of years ago, there was the insurrection, where thousands of Americans tried to storm this building. And so whether we're talking about 1863 or 1814 or 2021, right, this structure continues to be a kind of critical site, an important place in American history. All right, so obviously the US Capitol or whatever government buildings exist where you are now, these are kind of special buildings, right? They tend to be large and expensive and elaborate, and they have this powerful symbolic meaning. But we're surrounded by buildings every day. So we can think about buildings in terms of the everyday environment. And so here is a little village in the mountains in Japan. And it is a village that's so isolated that many of the buildings here look very much the same as they did 200 years ago, right? So all these farmhouses, right? And so they look something like this. These are not designed by architects. They're designed by local carpenters and constructed by carpenters and also by the people who live in them. And so a building like this is completely different than a building like this, in the sense that this is a kind of unique representation of an entire country. And this is a kind of anonymous residence of an individual household. But in the same way that we can read meanings in a building like the US Capitol, we can also kind of look at and analyze a building like this and understand certain things about the people who built and used it. So let's take a look inside. All right, so you'll notice here, there are no chairs and there are no tables here. All of you are from all over the world, as I could see from the chat. Some of you may be in buildings and where you're sitting on chairs. Some of you may be sitting on the floor. And when we look at a picture like this, we understand that at this time, Japan was a floor culture. Instead of sitting on a chair, you sat on these mats. These mats are called tatami, and they're soft. So they're laid over a wooden floor, so they're comfortable to sit on. And instead of a chair to sit on, you would sit on the floor. Instead of a bed to sleep on, you would sleep on the floor. And so just by looking at this picture, we can understand that this was a very different culture in terms of the way they used the building than, for instance, the culture I'm a part of right now, sitting in my chair in my office. Right? So it's a floor culture. What else can we see? What else can we infer from this image of the inside of this farmhouse? Well, look at this big column right here, and then this big beam right here, and these other columns here and beams here, right? Some of these are very, very large wooden timbers, and they are carefully planed so that they are nice and rectangular, right? So the column is kind of square. This beam, which is about this deep, it's a huge beam, is also very expertly shaped. This tells us that this part of the house was constructed by professional carpenters, right? And so they had very, very high skills in terms of shaping wood. So the ground floor here is built by professional carpenters. But when we look at the roof looks very different. So instead of those big, kind of perfectly planed rectangular beams, we now have these small rafters here, right? So look how different this beam and this column are from these little round rafters. These joints here, where say the column beam connect, those are very carefully shaped by the carpenters. And so they kind of go together almost like a puzzle. But for the roof, it's rope. So essentially, the roof is simply tied together with rope. So this is one kind of construction technique. It's kind of easy and low tech. And this one was much more difficult and required much greater skill. The reason for this is that a roof like this has to be replaced quite frequently. So this is simply thatch, so it's reeds. And they decay. So after 10 or 15 years, you need to replace the roof. Well, this is this little mountainous village in the middle of nowhere. And so it was not big enough to have carpenters there all the time. So the carpenters would come, they would build the ground floor, but then the roof would actually be constructed by the people who lived in the village, because the roof had to be kind of maintained by the village. There were no specialist roofers or carpenters who lived in the village. And so the roof then is made out of these small scale, low tech components. And so what would happen is that every 10 or 15 years, the entire village would get together and they would re-roof one of these houses. And so here's a modern version, and you can see we have dozens and dozens of people. And so they're carrying the big bundles of thatch and they're putting them up on the roof. And so this is all done not by specialized workers, but simply by all the villagers who lived around this house. And this was necessary again because in a tiny village like this, everyone was a farmer. Nobody was a carpenter or an architect. And so everyone had to pitch in. And they could do that if this was a kind of small scale, low tech job. And so these wooden members here are relatively small, and they're all tied together by rope. So with a few minutes of training, you or I or anybody else could help work on this roof. We don't need specialized tools. We don't need specialized knowledge. If you can tie a rope and climb up on the roof, you can be part of the rebuilding of the roof. So we can see in this building two different technologies. One is based on skilled labor and very large wooden timbers. The other one is based not on skilled carpenters, but on everyday labor. So it's low tech and a relatively small piece of wood that are easy to carry and easy to erect. And in this very mountainous and snowy region, the roof is very big and it's very steep, right? Because you want a steep roof because that way the snow falls off it instead of building up on the roof. And so then you have this huge area beneath the roof, right? So here's the main floor. The main floor right there. And then here's a huge roof, under roof area here. And so what happens was that the villagers had to find something to do during the wintertime. There was too much snow on the ground to farm or do anything outside during the winter. And so what they did is they turned to the cultivation of silkworms. And so silk, as you probably know, is produced by silkworms who spin a little cocoon. And then you put the cocoon in water and you turn the cocoon into a very, very long strand of silk. And so the villagers then, during the cold months, would actually farm silkworms in this area up here, which is this area right in there. And so the house then was adapted to the particular kind of climatic and economic conditions of the area. And so when we look at a building like this, we can understand, not the government of the entire country as we can with a building like this one, but we understand the everyday lives and the local economy, the local customs and so forth of those people. And the last theme I'll touch on broadly has to do with the creation of architecture that represents a different world. And I'm showing you an example from 800 years ago in France, but you could do the same with a Hindu temple in India, or with a mosque in Damascus, or with a Buddhist grotto in Korea. So many religious buildings are actually intended to connect us to another world. So if a building like this is about the kind of everyday environment all around us, it's about our immediate surroundings, then many buildings, especially religious buildings, are almost the opposite. They're intended to create us to a different and often kind of higher world. So this is a royal chapel created by King Louis IX in Paris almost 800 years ago. And it served as a symbol of the power of the king and of the importance of religion in France. And it also served as a reliquary. So a reliquary is an object, usually not a building, usually a smaller object, like a box. But a reliquary is something that contains relics that are associated, in this case, with Christianity. And so this building was intended almost like a jewel box, right? So to hold these valuable items. So in this case, it was fragments of the crown of thorns that was worn by Christ at the crucifixion and other important relics of Christianity. Now, this building had many symbolic purposes. It was a symbol of the power of the king. It was a symbol of the importance of Christianity in France. And so it was a large building. It's even said that it looks a little bit like a crown, right? So it has all these things sticking up here all around the building. And so the building itself starts to look a little bit like a crown on top. It's actually a very simple building inside. On the ground floor, it has one big room, and on the second floor, so here's a ground floor here, second floor here, so it's just kind of two big rooms. But the big room on the second floor here is one of the great spaces in European architecture, because this space was intended to evoke the kingdom of heaven. So there are passages in the Christian Bible that describe heaven as a place of colored light and precious jewels and gold. And so this structure was inspired by those written descriptions of heaven in the Christian Bible. So the stained glass, the colored glass here, brings in light of all imaginable hues. And then the entire top part of the building really is made up of this colored glass. And this was extremely rare at the time. Glass was very expensive. So most buildings didn't have any glass at all. Buildings that did have glass had usually small panes of clear glass. And so when you have an entire wall here made out of glass, right? So from here all the way up to the ceiling, it's almost all glass, with just enough stone in here really to hold the glass in place. A space like that would have been essentially unique at this time in the early 1200s. And so it was intended to evoke that vision of heaven that was described in the Christian Bible. So when you entered into this room, you felt like you were entering not just another building, but you felt like you were moving from our world into the kingdom of God. And so this was a structure that connected one kind of world, the world of the Christian heaven, to the everyday world. So we enter on the ground floor in our world. All right, so we enter down here, and that room has thick walls and it's relatively dark. And then we go up here via the stairs, and we come out here, and it's like we've gone from the mundane, everyday world here to the kingdom of heaven up here. Now today, right, we see color everywhere. You're watching this webinar on a color monitor. You're probably wearing clothes that have some color in them. You might have a magazine or a book next to you that has color. So our world today is saturated by artificial color. But 800 years ago in Paris, there was very little color. So the light and all the glowing hues of these windows would have created an atmosphere that was completely unlike anything that you would experience elsewhere. So you would have felt like you had entered again into the kingdom of God. And these stained glass windows told stories as well. So it wasn't just that they were colorful and beautiful and brought in this kind of ethereal light, but it's also that by looking at these windows, you could understand stories about Christianity. This is a representation of the Last Judgment, for instance, in the great window here on the west side of the chapel. And so when we think about architecture, as I mentioned, most of us, and actually I'll tell you, I'm not even an architect. I'm an architectural historian, right? So I study architecture, mostly of the modern world, but I look at architecture from thousands of years ago, as well as architecture from yesterday. So whether you're an architect or not, and like I said, the number of architects in the world is relatively small. Architecture is important to you because it surrounds you every day. You live in it, you work in it, you worship in it. And so, as I mentioned when we started out, it's important to think about architecture for all these reasons, right? We can look at a building, think about it in terms of art and beauty. We can think about it in terms of technology. So as you walk by a construction site, you can see what they're building that structure out of. Steel, concrete, wood, stone. And you can look at that building. And when you see what it's made out of, let's say it's made out of brick, you can also think about how that brick influences the size, the form, and other characteristics of that building. We can think about architecture as this great political, social, and cultural act. Because as I mentioned, in most places, for most of human history, the most expensive thing that was created by a culture was actually the buildings. And we live in buildings, we work in buildings, we worship in buildings, right? So most of us live in environments, especially if you live in a city, where our everyday experience is dominated by those buildings. So the better we understand them, the better environment we can create. And finally, right, we have buildings that kind of connect us to other worlds. Many of these are religious buildings. And across many religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, we have this idea of a building as a kind of conduit, a connector to another world. And so, as I mentioned, right, most of us aren't architects. Some of us are involved in architecture in other ways. I'm a historian. Other people work in construction or in maintenance. But even still, most of us are not directly connected to the world of building, at least not as someone who works in that field. But all of us, regardless of where you are, regardless of what you choose as your profession, as your occupation, you will be engaged in this world of architecture. And so the better you understand architecture, the better home you can live in, the better workplace you can work in, the more powerful place of worship you can help create. And so it doesn't matter what you choose to do in your future life. Architecture will be relevant. As a citizen, as a worker, as a member of a family, architecture is all around you. And the better you understand it, the more you can kind of take from it, the better environment you can help create. So that's all I have for you today. I look forward to some questions, and I can't wait to see what you have come up with to ask about. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Don. I do want to take a quick second to share the attendance link in the chat. And then you can follow that first link to fill out your attendance form. Make sure that you are signed into your Aspire account before trying to access the form. If you're on your mobile device, we recommend saving the link for later so you can participate in the Q&A, or you can go ahead and fill out that information now. It'll also continuously be shared. In the meantime, we can take a few questions from those who have their hand raised. Right now, I will take a question from Shah Khalid. So Shah, if you'd like to unmute your microphone, you can go ahead and ask your question. Shah Khalid, do you have a question? All right. No worries. I think we'll just move on to someone else. Shah, if you have a question, you can write it in the Q&A. Let's take a question from, Deborah Mangenzi. So Deborah, if you'd like to unmute your microphone, you can go ahead and ask your question as well.
I wanted to ask, yesterday I missed the lesson, so how do I sign my attendance form for yesterday?
Okay, so with that, please send us an email at info@aspireleaders.org. If you do have a question, please make sure your question is related to the seminar. If you don't have a question related to the seminar, you can go ahead and lower your hand. So again, hands raised only for folks that have questions related to the seminar. All right. And so I will take another question from Array Sari. Array, if you'd like to unmute your microphone and ask a question for the.
Okay, I am. And my question is that in building process, can we say that architects give instructions to the builders, the engineers especially? Can we say that?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the unusual things about architects today, is that in many situations, for instance, in the United States, you usually have an architect, and the architect is responsible for the building as a whole. And so then they have engineers, and there is a building contractor, and so the architect is kind of supervisor up here, and then has to guide all the other people who build it. But that's actually very unusual. It's very common today in the United States, for instance, and in many other countries. But it's actually an unusual situation. And so one of the movements in architecture today, in many places, is to actually change that model where the architect is kind of the top giving instructions to the engineers and the contractors and so forth, and to create a model in which there's kind of more cooperation. So instead of the architect saying, engineer, you have to do that, and building contractor, you have to do that, there is more of a collaboration. Because, you know, if you talk to engineers, a lot of them will complain about architects, asking them to do things that don't really work very well. And the same thing is true for the people who are actually constructing building. So the contemporary model is to have the architect telling engineers essentially what they want to have done, but that also creates its own set of problems. And so historically, there was a much closer connection between the people who actually designed the building and the people who built it. And so the modern model of the architect as kind of supervisor is not necessarily the only or the best way to execute a building.
Thank you so much for your question. I see another hand raised from Kelly Huang. So Kelly, if you'd like to unmute, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so I wanted to say thank you for presenting, and I was curious about this topic because as someone who's currently in Japan for the summer, I've been noticing a lot of the different architecture around me, such as being able to walk outside and see a skyscraper or being able to see a Buddhist temple just across the street. And I was curious to know if you believe that there is an ideal architectural space that exists, whether that's like a cultural building or a building that represents political nuances, or if these different architectural spaces need to exist or coexist together in order for there to be some form of like deeper understanding. Yeah,
That's
just
very
wanted to share
interesting. That's a really fascinating question. And I think that different people would have different perspectives on that. If you are in Japan right now, you probably see that Japanese cities are composed of lots of different kinds of buildings. There's some wooden buildings, concrete buildings, steel buildings, modern buildings, some older ones, temple here, you know, supermarket there. For me, the kind of heterogeneity, the kind of variety of buildings and spaces is really, really appealing. And so, for instance, for me, if I were in Japan, I might go to a 1,000-year-old temple, Buddhist temple, and I would be fascinated by it. But then I might go to Tokyo Sky Tree, right, which is new and completely different, and I'd be fascinated by that as well. But there are other people at other times who would argue actually that a particular style of architecture is the one that we should use for everything. So if you go to Paris, for instance, a lot of Paris was built in the late 1800s, and most of those buildings are in the same style. So there is kind of consistency in many parts of Paris that you don't get in, say, Tokyo. So like I said, there are many different perspectives on this. And one of the great things about architecture, like I said, is that we're all involved in it because we all use it for one reason or another, whether you're working, sleeping, or shopping, or whatever. And so my hope is simply that people become more engaged in the kind of built environment around them. So for me, there's no kind of ideal, and the interest comes in the variety and the changes over time.
Thank you so much for your question, Kelly. We'll take one more question from a raised hand from Goodwin. So Goodwin, if you, sorry, 1 second, lost it there. Oh no, it looks like Goodwin had dropped off of the meeting, unfortunately. Oh no, I see you here. Goodwin, if you'd like to unmute.
Okay, all right. Hello, please can you hear me?
Wonderful, yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you so much. So my question is about how architecture is adjusting to recent conversations in sustainability. So now the entire conversation is centered on sustainability, and how is architecture adjusting to that? And also in that area, the focus is on using some specific materials for architectural designs for buildings and all of that, which will protect the environment. I want to know how this could also affect the kind of monumental designs that we have come to meet. Are we going to see more of that in the future, or that trajectory is going to change and we're going to see different kind of monumental designs coming up, looking at the materials and the material integrity conversations that are ongoing? Thank you.
Thanks, Godwin. That is an incredibly important topic about the relationship of architecture and sustainability. So some people estimate that up to 40% of the carbon footprint actually comes from construction and from buildings. Because, you know, if you're constructing, say, a concrete office building, it's incredibly carbon intensive. The transportation of materials, the materials themselves, and so forth. So if we don't deal with sustainability in architecture, we can't really deal with sustainability as a whole, right? So we often think about, say, you know, automobiles and, you know, as a primary factor in climate change. But actually the architecture is the single largest area contributing to climate change. And so in architecture, over the last few decades, we've become more and more focused on this idea of sustainable design. And so some of the most exciting things in architecture today are happening because of this focus on sustainable materials and other strategies for producing less carbon. However, it's also possible to say that there's another aspect of architecture today that is really working against sustainability. So if you go to the famous buildings today, whether it's a famous museum in Los Angeles or a famous office building in London or around the world, many of the most expensive and the most visible buildings are actually terribly non-sustainable. So on one hand, there's a desire to create buildings that are eye-catching and beautiful and unique, but those buildings often work against sustainable design. So Godwin, you brought up the question of materials. And so concrete is a terrible material from the point of view of sustainability. Concrete cannot be recycled. There's a huge carbon footprint in concrete. But probably the majority of large buildings in the world today are produced using concrete because it's affordable and easily obtained. And so wood and earth and sun-dried brick and traditional materials like that are far, far better from the point of view of sustainability. And so there are many designers and builders who are trying to use timber or earth instead of steel and concrete to construct buildings. But you know, the 100-story skyscrapers and structures like that are possible only at this point with steel and concrete. And so really moving forward with sustainability probably means not just changing materials, but kind of changing kind of larger approaches and perspectives on architecture. But a great and important question, Godwin. Thanks.
Thanks so much for your question. I actually see a related question here in the Q&A. There's a question here from someone named Smith. Smith asks, timber is not widely used for construction, but I have seen houses built with timber at Chikangawa. Again, very sorry for mispronouncing, forest in northern Malawi, and they are not eaten by termites. And that makes me think of advocating for sustainable housing using timber, which is cheaper than most building materials. Is it within this background that I ask, what is the maximum lifespan of modern houses built with wood?
Thanks, Smith. That's a wonderful question, because wood, of course, can be very, very sustainable. And depending on what kind of wood you can use, it can last a long time as well. In the United States, for instance, where I live, the vast majority, I would say 99%, more than 99% of houses are built with wood. And these houses can last with proper maintenance hundreds and hundreds of years. They do require maintenance, but you know, all buildings really require upkeep. And so it is possible to build structures that are extremely durable using wood. Wood can be very sustainable, but also, again, to speak of my own situation, here in California, we used to have these huge redwood forests, and redwood is an incredible building material. You mentioned the material from the Chikangawa forest that's very termite resistant. And the redwood in California too was insect resistant and rot resistant. So a great building material. But it also meant that we cut down all of these huge old growth forests to build buildings with. And so that in itself, of course, we wouldn't do today because it's terrible for our environment. So yes, wood can be used for enduring construction, and it can be very friendly to the environment, but it has to be properly conceived, because in many places, you know, forests actually get destroyed because of the desire for timber for building. But certainly it is a material that I think we'll use more and more of as we move forward and attempt to mitigate climate change.
So thank you so much for your question. I do see another question here that I'd like to take from the Q&A. This question comes from Ayamo Belinda. They ask, for years, I thought architecture had only to do with buildings, but from your presentation, I got to see that art and sculpture are also a part of architecture. I would like to have a brief definition then of architecture as a whole with all that it would entail.
Okay, that is really a fun question. So back when I was a student in college, 35 years ago, when I started studying architecture, people were really looking at architecture as a kind of art, and also as almost like engineering. So there were kind of two prongs of it. There was a kind of art and aesthetics aspect, and there was the engineering and construction aspect. Historically, the buildings that people were interested in, professors, academics, historians, so forth, were the kind of large, unique buildings. The US Capitol or St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, or the Great Mosque at Damascus, structures like that. Over the last 2 decades, the way that we historians have looked at architecture has changed. So many of us look at architecture now as what we call the built environment. So it's not just famous buildings and big buildings, but it's everyday buildings like houses and grocery stores and gas stations. But it's all the things that we've built that we inhabit. And so I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons I love architecture is because architecture kind of has to do with everything. So regardless of whether you're an architect or not, you're engaged in architecture. And so for me, and for many of my colleagues, architecture is really the whole built environment. So it really encompasses all aspects of this: construction, decoration, function, and all of this. So each one of us has a kind of different set of interests and a different role in the built environment, but we are all engaged in it to some point.
Thank you again for that question. All right, so it looks like we have about 10 minutes left, so I'm gonna take some questions from folks with their hand raised. I see a hand raised by Faith Taiwo. So Faith, I'm going to ask you to unmute and then you can ask your question. All right, Faith, are you there? All right, we'll just move forward. Faith, if you have your question, you can enter it in the chat, and if we can, we'll try to get to it right away. I see somebody here, Dacia. Dacia, sorry. If you'd like to unmute, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Do you hear me?
Sorry, could you speak up one more time?
Okay, I'm Daku Dosia from Benin. I want to ask a question about a great building. How does the great building architect approach site select and landscape to minimize environment impact? And if possible, what material and construction technique does a green building architect propose for certain building projects? Thank you.
Okay, sorry that the connection was bad, so I didn't catch all that. Can you repeat that question for us?
Sorry, Dacia, you can go ahead and unmute again.
Hello, I asked about how does a great building architect promote in the what material and the construction technique does a great building architect promise for certain building projects? I want to know the material we can use for a great building and how we can, what type of technique we can use for it. Thank you.
Okay, great. And so, as a historian, I tend to think about questions like this from a historical viewpoint. And I would say that today, we would be very much interested in looking at the materials that are kind of local to the environment and culture. So the way we build where I'm in California would be different than the way you might build somewhere else in the world. We have different, because the climate, the materials, the customs are different everywhere. And so today, for instance, I think many architects would want to use materials and technologies that were kind of endemic to the area. Back in the 1950s, for instance, so, well, a long time ago, but not that long ago. In the 1950s, people were building large structures all over the world that were essentially similar. And so they would build an office building in New York that looked like one in Mexico City, that looked like one in Nairobi. And so all over the world, you had buildings that had the same technology, same materials. And now we realize that's not a good way to build, because the customs, the climate, the local environment are different everywhere. So now I would say an architect might be interested in looking at materials that have a history of use in that area. So in Japan, for instance, where there's a long culture of wood, there are architects who are interested in using more wood. Here in California, for instance, as well, we have often built in wood. And so there's use, for instance, of mass timber, which is kind of large scale engineered timber to build structures. So in general, I'd say really, many of us are hoping that the materials and technologies that are used across the world will be really more tailored to the particular location of that structure.
Thank you so much, Dacia, for your question. I think we have enough time for one more question. I see a hand raised, Sylvia Cardenas. So Sylvia, if you'd like to unmute, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi. My question is, what are your thoughts on restoration of old buildings or abandoned buildings to give them new use, mostly regards on sustainability?
Okay, this is another really crucial question, and I love that you all have been asking questions that are so central to architecture today. In the modern world, which let's say from the 1950s today, in the modern world, in so many places, the emphasis on is been building new. So right, tearing down old buildings and building new buildings. But for various reasons, especially ideas of sustainability, we understand that often retrofitting and repairing and reusing buildings is much, much friendlier to the environment. And so we see many more examples of the reuse and the kind of kind of imagining of historical buildings, of older buildings. And so I think in many cases that's really important, partly because in terms of sustainability in the environment, it's better because, you know, when you build new, not only do you have to get rid of the old building, which is a huge amount of material that goes to waste, but as I mentioned, construction is the kind of the area that is most responsible for carbon emissions, right? So this reuse of existing buildings is really crucial from the point of view of sustainability, but also from the point of view of our everyday surroundings. It's important because when you have older buildings, you get a variety in a city, but you also have continuity. And so if you keep on tearing down and then building new buildings, there's no continuity in a city. And so there's never any, what happens is that there's a sense of place, right? Every city has a different feeling, you know, New York, Seoul, Accra, right? Every city feels different. And that's partly because we have historical buildings there that convey that, you know, that history, that culture. Whereas if you build new, then you're getting, you know, a kind of 2023 building, and many of those 2023 buildings in any given city look like buildings from another city. And so if you travel, for instance, for pleasure, you know, you might go to, you know, I don't know where you specifically might go, but, you know, you might go to Mexico City, you might go to Hong Kong, you might go to Lisbon. And actually, a lot of the attraction in going to a city like that is in the buildings. You know, you might not be going to see architecture, but it's the atmosphere, the immediate environment when you walk around that is compelling. And that's because those places have buildings that speak of that place and that culture and that history. So simply from the point of view of kind of meaningful environment, I think the reuse of existing buildings is really crucial.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to the end of our seminar today. Thank you so much again, Dr. Choi, for joining us today and giving us this very insightful presentation on architecture. I also very much learned a lot today. a lot of things that I didn't know that were included in architecture, and how important the materials that we use are, and sustainability is also a very important thing. So thank you so much again for giving us this presentation today.
Thanks very much for having me. You all had great questions, and it was a real pleasure to hear them.
All right, thank you all again for joining us for this faculty seminar this morning. For last time, we're going to be sharing the attendance link in the chat. Again, that first link is the attendance link. You can go ahead and use that to mark your attendance for this seminar. Please make sure you are signed into your Aspire account before accessing that attendance form. Thank you all very much. The recording of this session will be made available at the end of the week. Thank you all, and have a great day.